You're listening to MC Noctis, where every shadow has a story. Tonight, I'm taking you to a small town in West Virginia, where one funeral was followed by 12 more. The people there used to say that death came in threes. They stopped saying that after the Calder family. I was 13 when my family filled our house with 23 children and kept every light burning for 10 straight nights. The adults told us there was sickness in the next valley. That was a lie. Something had been moving from funeral to funeral, calling members of the same family by name. And by the time they brought the old man from the mountains, it had already learned mine. This happened in the summer of 2003 in a West Virginia town called Ash Creek. There were 117 houses, 1 gas station, 2 churches, and a volunteer fire department that spent more time rescuing dogs from wells than fighting fires. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew the Calder family. The Calders had lived along the eastern ridge for so long that half the roads carried their names. They owned pasture, timber, and an old white farmhouse that could be seen from almost anywhere in the valley. My father's younger sister, Rebecca, had married Samuel Calder. That made their 2 children, Ben and Molly, my cousins. It also meant that when death entered the Calder house, it was allowed to come close to mine. The first person to die was Adeline Calder. She was 96 years old and had been confined to a bed for almost 6 years. By the end, she rarely spoke. Most days, she stared at the bedroom doorway as though she were waiting for someone to enter. According to Aunt Rebecca, Adeline had refused to sleep after sunset during her final week. Whenever anyone turned off the lamp, the old woman would claw at the sheets and whisper the same thing. "Not in the dark. He counts better in the dark." She died during a thunderstorm. The power failed shortly before midnight, and the battery clock beside her bed stopped at 11:47. Nobody knew exactly when she took her last breath. My aunt found her sometime before dawn. Adeline's eyes were open. Her right hand was raised above the blanket with the index finger extended, as though she had died pointing at someone beside the bed. They buried her 3 days later in the Calder family cemetery. During the graveside service, the minister's watch stopped. So did my father's. So did every battery clock inside the farmhouse. All of them stopped at 3:17. 3 nights after the burial, Adeline's eldest son, Louis, died in his sleep. He had been 68, strong enough to split his own firewood, and had never been diagnosed with a heart condition. His wife woke at 3:17 in the morning and found him cold beside her. There was black soil beneath his tongue. At the funeral, I heard 2 older women whisper that Adeline had not gone into the ground alone. My mother heard them too. She took my hand and led me away before I could ask what they meant. 6 days later, another Calder died. The second death belonged to Adeline's nephew, Frank. He fell asleep in his chair after dinner and never woke. His television remained on until morning. The digital clock beneath it had frozen at 3:17. Then came Carol Calder, 44 years old, found at the bottom of her basement steps. The coroner said she had broken her neck in the fall. What he could not explain were the bare footprints in the coal dust behind her. They began at a concrete wall and ended beside her body. After Carol, The funerals came so quickly that Ash Creek seemed to exist beneath the sound of church bells. 11 people died in 31 days. Some were old, some were young. A few had married into the family and did not carry colder blood at all. Every death happened between 3:12 and 3:17 in the morning. And before each one, somebody in the house reported hearing a deceased relative outside a window or calling from an empty room. The Calders stopped sleeping alone. They covered mirrors. They left radios playing through the night. They drove iron nails above their doors because an old woman at the Baptist church told them death could not cross cold iron. Nothing helped. Aunt Rebecca and my mother visited 3 different people who claimed to understand hauntings. One burned herbs through the Calder farmhouse. Another tied red thread around every bedpost. A third sat at Adeline's grave until sunset, then left without accepting payment. He told my aunt to move her children out before the dead learned their voices. Samuel refused to leave. He said grief and panic were making everyone foolish. He was 39, healthy, and angry that strangers had begun treating his family like they carried a disease. The people of Ash Creek had stopped visiting Calder homes. Parents would not let their children play with Ben or Molly. At the grocery store, conversations ended whenever my aunt entered an aisle. Samuel said running away would only prove that the rumors had won. 2 nights later, Aunt Rebecca woke because somebody was tapping on the bedroom window. Their room was on the 2nd floor. She heard Adeline's voice outside the glass. "Samuel, your mother is waiting." My aunt shook her husband, but he would not wake. By the time she switched on the lamp, his skin was cold. The clock read 3:17. Samuel was lying on his back with both hands folded over his chest. His bare feet were covered in wet grave soil. The bedroom door was still locked from the inside. That was when my father stopped calling it superstition. He and Aunt Rebecca spent 4 days driving across the state, asking ministers, funeral directors, and anyone else who might know how to stop what was happening. Most people refused to become involved. One man agreed to speak with them. His name was Jonas Rook. Jonas Rook lived more than 100 miles from Ash Creek, beyond 2 mountain passes and a stretch of road that did not appear on my father's map. He was 73 years old and lived with his wife in a narrow house surrounded by black walnut trees. People called him a dowser, a faith healer, or a fraud, depending on who was telling the story. Jonas called himself a man who paid attention. He did not ask my father how many people had died. Instead, he told Aunt Rebecca to return home, take 1 leaf from the mountain laurel growing beside the Calder cemetery, place it beneath Adeline's family Bible, and bring it back before sunrise. My aunt did exactly as he said. The leaf was green when she picked it. By the time she placed it on Jonas Rook's kitchen table, it had turned the color of wood ash. Black veins spread from the stem, and the edges crumbled when he touched them. Jonas looked at my father. "This isn't following blood anymore," he said. "It's following invitations." My aunt asked what that meant. He explained that the first dead person called to somebody who loved her. When that person answered, death gained another voice. Then 2 dead people could call. After the next death, there were 3. It was not a chain, it was a choir. Every funeral made it louder. Aunt Rebecca begged him to come to Ash Creek. Jonas said he could not. Not yet. Whatever had entered Adeline's grave was too strong, and he needed 10 days to prepare. Until then, Every child connected to the Calder family had to leave the valley. He told my father to take them to our farm. This surprised him because my father had never mentioned where we lived. Jonas said the Hale property stood on land that remembered an act of mercy. During the influenza epidemic of 1918, my great-grandfather had opened his barn to sick families whom the town would not shelter. 13 strangers died there. He buried them on the highest part of the farm and carved each of their names into stone. "Ground remembers what people do on it," Jonas said. "Your land owes your family a kindness." He warned them to keep every light burning after sunset. If someone called from outside, nobody was to answer. If they saw a familiar face beyond a window, they were to look at the person's feet. The dead, he said, always forgot to make the grass bend. Before my father left, Jonas gripped his wrist. "Do not count the children after dark," he said. "And if you hear a child counting for you, make enough noise that nobody hears the final number." By the following evening, the first cars began arriving at our farm. Our farmhouse held 23 children by the end of the second day. Some were my cousins. Others belonged to distant branches of the Calder family I had never met. The youngest was only 8 months old. The oldest was 17. The adults placed mattresses across every bedroom floor. The dining room became a nursery. People slept on couches, beneath tables, and in the upstairs hallway. During the day, it felt like summer camp. We played baseball in the pasture, fought over food, and told ghost stories until the adults shouted at us to stop. At night, the house changed. Every lamp remained on. My father connected work lights to a generator in case the electricity failed. The adults sat near the doors with coffee, flashlights, and hunting rifles they all knew would be useless. Nobody laughed after sunset. On the fourth night, I woke on the living room floor and heard a woman walking around the house. She moved slowly through the wet grass. At each window, she stopped and whispered a number. 19. Then footsteps. 20. Then another window. 21. I sat up and saw my father standing in the doorway. His face had gone pale. The woman reached the window behind me. 22. My father snatched a metal pan from the kitchen and began striking it with a wooden spoon. The noise woke the entire house. Babies screamed. Dogs barked. Adults shouted questions over one another. Beneath all of it, I heard the woman laugh. She never said 23. The following morning, we found a line of bare footprints circling the house. The grass beneath them was still standing straight. On the 10th day, Jonas Rook gave my father a handwritten list. The Calders spent nearly everything they had buying what it required: white linen, beeswax candles, salt, iron chain, black coffee, apples, cornmeal, tobacco, 12 lanterns, and enough food to cover 3 long tables. They built the tables in the yard of the Calder farmhouse. Offerings covered them from end to end. Jonas instructed everyone to prepare food and drinking water for 3 days, because nobody participating in the ritual would be permitted to leave the property. When he finally arrived, he came alone. He wore an ordinary black suit and carried a wooden case bound with tarnished iron. Before going to the Calder house, he entered our farmhouse and stood before the small shelf containing our family Bible and photographs of the dead. Then he looked directly at me. "This one is stubborn," he told my father. "Smart enough to survive, foolish enough to look when he should run." My father rested a hand on my shoulder. Jonas kept watching me. "Keep him away from the white cloth," he said. I wish they had told me that part. The ritual began at sunset. Jonas changed into a long grey coat with small iron bells sewn inside the sleeves. He placed 12 lanterns in a circle around the Calder yard and connected them with an unbroken line of salt. In the center, he spread a sheet of white linen over the ground. Nobody was allowed to step on it. He warned my aunt that once she crossed from our farm onto Calder land, she could not speak until the ritual ended. She could not answer questions, call anyone's name, or react to anything she saw. The dead, he said, would use obedience against her. Then he described 3 conditions. The first had to occur at midnight on the second night. A living body carrying 2 heartbeats would enter Ash Creek beneath iron. If the water accepted one shape and returned none, the first condition would be fulfilled. The second would occur at 6 in the evening on the third day. A white animal belonging to no Calder would cross running water and break the soil above Adeline's grave without being led by a human hand. If both events happened, Jonas would reveal the third condition. My father believed the ritual had already failed. There were no pregnant women involved in it, and no white livestock anywhere in Ash Creek. The nearest pale horse belonged to a farm nearly 20 miles away. But Jonas did not ask anyone to find those things. He told them to wait. For the next 2 days, he walked between the farmhouse and cemetery, ringing a small iron bell and reading names from the Calder family Bible. Each time he spoke the name of somebody who had died, one of the 12 lanterns went out. Nobody touched them. The flames simply folded into themselves. By sunset on the second day, only 3 lanterns remained burning. That evening, I overheard my parents discussing the conditions in our kitchen. They did not know I was listening from the hallway. My mother said it was impossible. My father said impossible things had already killed 11 people. At 11:30, they left for Ash Creek. They ordered me to stay with the other children. I waited 5 minutes, climbed out of my bedroom window, and followed them on my bicycle. I left the bike in the trees above the creek and crawled through wet weeds until I could see the old footbridge. Jonas stood on one bank. My father and aunt stood on the other. Nobody spoke. At exactly midnight, a light appeared on the road. The light came from an old miner's lamp. A woman was walking down the center of the road toward the creek. She wore a faded blue dress that hung loosely around her legs. Her stomach was swollen with pregnancy, and both hands rested beneath it as though supporting the child inside. The miner's helmet on her head was rusted and far too large. The lamp, fixed to its front, produced a weak yellow beam. She walked past my hiding place. Her skin was colorless. Water dripped from her dress, even though the night was dry. As she passed, I heard 2 heartbeats. One was slow and steady. The other raced like the wings of a trapped bird. The woman reached the bank and stepped into Ash Creek. Nobody tried to stop her. The water climbed over her shoes, her knees, and then her waist. The creek was shallow enough that it should never have risen above her thighs. But with every step, she sank deeper. When the water reached her chest, she turned toward the place where I was hiding. "Aaron," she said. My entire body went cold. I had never seen her before. She raised one finger to her lips. Then she turned back toward the creek and walked beneath the surface. The miner's lamp continued glowing underwater. It moved slowly toward the deepest part of the channel, then stopped. For several seconds, the yellow light remained motionless beneath the black water. Then it went out. No body surfaced. Jonas rang his iron bell once. The sound traveled across the creek and returned from the opposite bank as two separate echoes. My aunt collapsed to her knees, but she did not speak. I remained in the weeds until everyone had gone. The next morning, the town searched the creek. They found no footprints on the road and no sign that anyone had entered the water. An elderly man who lived nearby heard the description and showed my father an old newspaper clipping. The woman in the photograph was named Evelyn Price. She had disappeared in 1961 while 7 months pregnant. Her husband had been a coal miner. Searchers found his helmet beside Ash Creek, but they never found Evelyn. The helmet in the photograph had a dent above the left ear. So did the one I had seen. I told nobody that she had spoken my name. At the Calder house, Jonas examined the creek water collected in a glass jar. A thin, black film had formed across its surface. He told my father the first condition had been fulfilled. 1 living shape had entered. 2 deaths had answered. Then he looked toward the trees where I was standing, although I was certain he could not see me. He lifted the bell and rang it a second time. This time, the echo said my name. The third day of the ritual was hot and windless. By late afternoon, most of Ash Creek had gathered along the road near the Calder Cemetery. Nobody crossed the salt line, but fear had become stronger than politeness. People wanted to see whether Jonas Rook was about to save the family or expose himself as a fraud. At 5:50, nothing had happened. My father kept looking toward the western road. Aunt Rebecca stood beside Jonas in complete silence. Her face looked smaller than it had 3 days earlier. At 5:58, dogs began barking throughout the valley. At 5:59, we heard hooves. A white mare came running out of the trees. She had no saddle, bridle, or rope. Mud covered her legs, and blood marked one shoulder where she had forced herself through a fence. The mare crossed the shallow ford below the cemetery, climbed the bank, and ran directly through the crowd. People scattered. She did not slow down. At exactly 6 o'clock, she leaped over the cemetery wall and landed on Adeline Calder's grave. The wooden marker snapped beneath one hoof. The mare screamed and began striking the earth. She tore through flowers, churned the wet soil, and opened a long crack down the center of the grave. With each impact, something knocked from inside the coffin. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The crowd heard it. People began backing toward the road. The mare continued until the earth above the coffin had become black mud. Then she stopped, lowered her head, and stared into the crack. Every remaining lantern in the Calder yard went out. Jonas raised his iron bell. Before he could ring it, the mare turned toward him. In Adeline's voice, it said, "You are too late." Then it walked out of the cemetery and stood beside the road. Nobody dared approach it. Nearly an hour later, a farmer named Dale Mercer arrived from the next county. He said the mare belonged to his daughter and had broken through 2 fences before disappearing into the woods. His farm was 18 miles away and the opposite side of the Greenbrier River. The animal had crossed running water twice to reach us. Dale tried to lead her home, but she refused to move until Jonas covered her eyes with his grey coat. Only then did she follow. The second condition had been fulfilled. Jonas told my aunt to prepare the rain barrel in our yard. At midnight, he would show them the third. He also told my father to find me. "The boy has seen too much," he said, "and something has seen him back." My father found me before dark. He knew I had followed them to the creek. Jonas had told him about the voice in the bell. My father was furious, but there was no time to punish me. Jonas said sending me away now would only leave me unprotected. I had to remain inside our house until sunrise. At 11:45, Jonas brought the white linen from the center of the ritual circle to our farm. It was large enough to cover half the yard. He filled an old galvanized washtub with water from our rain barrel, then added salt, ashes from the Calder fireplace, and soil taken from each fresh grave. My father, my mother, Aunt Rebecca, and another Calder widow stood at the four corners of the folded cloth. Jonas lowered it into the black water. He told them that if the linen came out clean, the ritual had failed. If that happened, every Calder child had to leave West Virginia before morning and never return. At midnight, they lifted the sheet. I was supposed to be upstairs. Instead, I watched through the gap beneath the back porch. The four adults stepped away from one another and pulled the wet linen open. For a moment, it was perfectly white. Then the first footprint appeared. It formed near my mother's corner, black as coal dust. Another appeared beside it. Then 10 more. Within seconds, the cloth was covered in footprints. Bare feet, work boots, children's feet, the narrow heels of women's shoes. Some prints were tiny. Others were swollen and misshapen, as though made by bodies that had spent years underwater. They did not remain still. New prints appeared one after another, crossing the sheet in every direction. The sound of footsteps filled the yard, although nobody moved. Aunt Rebecca began laughing and crying at the same time. Jonas ordered her to remain silent. The footprints slowly turned toward the center of the cloth. One by one, they stopped. I counted 11 pairs belonging to the people who had recently died. Behind them stood dozens more. Those older prints led backward through the Calder family for generations. Then a final set appeared. They were the bare footprints of an old woman. They crossed over every other mark and stopped at the edge nearest the porch, nearest to me. The toes turned outward. Something beneath the sheet whispered, 23. Jonas threw his iron chain across the linen. The cloth jerked so violently that all four adults nearly lost their grip. Human shapes pushed upward beneath it. Faces stretched the wet fabric from below, mouths opening and closing without sound. Jonas wrapped the chain around the sheet while reciting every name from the Calder Bible in reverse order. When he reached Adeline, the lanterns at the distant farmhouse reignited at once. The shapes beneath the cloth collapsed. The footprints stopped moving. Jonas looked directly toward my hiding place. His nose was bleeding. His face had turned gray. "Erin Hale," he said. "Come out." I crawled from beneath the porch. He asked whether the woman in the creek had spoken to me. I lied. I told him she had not. Jonas stared at me for a long time. Then he folded one corner of the linen over the old woman's footprints. "A lie can close a door," he said, "but it cannot lock one." Jonas burned the linen before sunrise. The fire produced no heat, Black smoke fell toward the ground instead of rising, then flowed in a thin line toward the Calder cemetery. When the last piece of cloth became ash, the clock inside our farmhouse started ticking again. It read 3:18. No Calder died that night, or the next. The funeral stopped. Before leaving, Jonas finally explained what had begun the chain. In 1936, a flood trapped Adeline and her 4 young children inside the Calder farmhouse. The water reached the second floor before rescue boats arrived. Adeline later claimed she had prayed for help. Jonas said it had not been God who answered. She had begged for her children to be spared. In exchange, she promised that death could take her last, after every person she loved had lived a full life. The thing in the flood agreed to only half of the bargain. It allowed Adeline to die last, but the moment she died, everybody protected by the promise became due at once. That was why she had fought sleep for 6 years. She knew something was waiting for her final breath. The 3 conditions had given death 3 false accounts: 2 lives inside one body, an animal without human blood breaking the grave, and footprints without bodies to carry them. It confused the count long enough for Jonas to close the debt inside the linen. My father asked what the ritual had cost him. Jonas looked toward the sunrise. "Only the time I had left," he said. 2 weeks later, my father drove Aunt Rebecca back across the mountains to thank him. Jonas Rook was dead. His wife said he had known the exact hour. He had dug his own grave behind the black walnut trees and marked the place where his head should rest. He died at 3:17 in the morning, 11 days after the ritual. The Calders abandoned the old farmhouse. Aunt Rebecca moved her children to Ohio, and most of the younger family changed their last names or left the state. Nobody in Ash Creek would marry into the Calder family for years. I grew up, moved to North Carolina, and tried to convince myself that my memories had been distorted by frightened adults. For more than 20 years, no unexplained death touched the family. Then my mother died last month. She passed quietly in her sleep. The clock beside her bed had stopped at 3:17. After the funeral, my 7-year-old daughter Lucy asked why an old woman had been standing beside my mother's grave. I asked what the woman looked like. Lucy said she was very thin and kept pointing at me. That night, I woke to the sound of someone walking through our hallway. Bare feet moved slowly across the hardwood. They stopped outside Lucy's room. Then a woman began counting. 1. A pause. 2. I ran into the hallway and found it empty. Lucy's bedroom door was open. She was asleep, but black soil covered the soles of her feet. On the white rug beside her bed were 2 sets of footprints. One belonged to my daughter. The other belonged to an old woman. Both sets led into the room. Neither set led out. I am recording this because Jonas Rook was right about one thing. A lie can close a door. But the woman in the creek knew my name. And I have spent 23 years pretending she didn't. Last night, Lucy answered someone from the dark. This morning, there were 3 sets of footprints on the rug. Thank you for listening to MC Noctis, where every shadow has a story. If the Calder family's story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Would you answer the voice of someone you loved if it called to you from the dark? If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like the video and subscribe to MC Noctis for more true-feeling tales of horror. Until next time, keep your lights on after 3:17. And if you find footprints leading into your room, make sure they also lead back out.